In this episode of the rebuild, I'm going to go over the rocker arms and installation of those into the head here that I already have the block in. This is actually a couple months later. I had initially done this and I had done it wrong. I had been looking online and trying to figure out how the rockers go on. I saw lots of explanations on how you bring it to 0 lash, and I'll show that in a couple of minutes, and turn the bolt another half to 3/4 to get that preload that you're looking for in the lifter. Come to find out that that is wrong, because these are supposed to be torqued down. The bolts here, let me show that a little bit more clearly. It doesn't have the bridge with it, so the bridge will go on there as well. But just showing this up close, that right there, the bolt there, is supposed to get torqued down to 19 foot-pounds. So that pedestal there is supposed to go onto the rocker pedestal. So that flat end there needs to go on top of the rocker pedestal, and it's got to be torqued down. Again, I watched a lot of videos. Obviously, I haven't done this before, and they must have been dealing with GMs or Fords or something like that, where you do just turn it, and there's some kind of lock nut or something on the top so that the bolt is relatively loose there. For the Jeeps here, and I believe all the 4.2s and maybe some of the 4.0s, I'm not sure, you go ahead and torque this down on top of there. What that means is that when you torque it down, you need to get the correct preload on your lifter. So these are hydraulic flat tappet lifters. The oil pressure goes into the lifter cylinder, and it goes into that little hole there. I'm not going to go over, there are a million different videos on hydraulic lifters, how to pull them apart, how to check them, how they lock, that sort of thing. And so the oil goes into that little hole, it pumps up the lifter, locks it in place. The push rods, they're hollow. So they go there, the oil goes up the push rod, and you already see here, there's a little hole on top of the rocker. There's a little tiny hole up there. You can kind of see it right here. There's a little tiny hole there that the oil then comes through, and you already see there's a little bit of oil pooling in there because I had this running. And so it pours out and gets onto the pivot, and also drips over and gets into the springs. So that's how your whole top end gets oiled and lubricated, is from that pathway with the oil. So back to the torquing of the bolt for the rocker. That needs to be tightened down, and if you have stock cam and the diameter with the cam lobe on the flat part, you have stock lifters, you have stock push rods, you have stock rockers, you have stock springs, you have stock valves. The valve seats haven't been redone because that can change the height a little bit. You haven't had the head decked. Those are all things that can change the geometry, because you have the cam lobe obviously pushing up on the lifter, pushing up on the push rod, pushing up on the rocker, the pivot point, and then also the height of the valve stem. So all those things have to be exactly right, and you're good to go. Again, I saw lots of people seem to think that, and maybe they're right in most cases, that if you have stock everything, that you can just go ahead and you torque it down, you just forget it. You torque it and you forget it and you walk away, and it's good to go. You have the appropriate amount of preload on your lifter that it's going to provide enough that it's going to take up all the slack in the system. So where there's a little bit of preload in the lifter, this locks down when it gets to oil pressure, it locks it in place and snugs everything up, so you don't get any tapping, you don't get any valve noise, you don't get any looseness in that whole geometry of the push rod coming up and the rocker coming down on the valve here. You don't want any clacking, nothing else. And that's the way it's supposed to work. There's not a whole lot of forgiveness in the system. The preload in the lifters is supposed to be somewhere between, I've seen a couple different references, but somewhere in the range of 20 thousandths to 60 thousandths, and maybe 60 thousandths is a little high. I've seen that as well, but somewhere in that range. The little plunger in here, when the pressure in the preload goes, and it's pressing down on the plunger only has so much travel distance. And you're trying to get in the middle there somewhere, so where there's some preload in there, again 20 thousandths to 60 thousandths, just somewhere in that range, but not so much that it brings the spring all the way down, and essentially this becomes a solid lifter, and you can very easily eat up a cam. There'll be too much pressure on here, and there'll be no more give in the spring and the plunger, and so what will happen is your valves will never fully close. They'll always be engaged. The valve spring is stronger than the spring in here, so the valve spring will seat. The valves will seat, and this will pump up, and it will lock it in place. This will be harder than the spring once this is pumped up in place, but the spring inside of it is not. So again, it's just going to take up any slack. Every time you turn off your engine, this theoretically bleeds down. It provides a little softness. If there's been any wear in any part of the system, 1/1000ths, maybe even less than that over time, the hydraulic lifter takes that up. So anyway, in my opinion, it makes common sense if you're going to rebuild your engine, even if you're going to replace with all stock parts, which I mostly did, and I did have the head decked, that it makes sense to go ahead and check it. It doesn't take very long, but just to make sure that when you do torque it down, you get that appropriate preload on the lifter. So that's what I'm going to show right now. Again, this is for a Jeep. This is my 81 4.2, and the rockers are supposed to be torqued down. Again, I did find one video that went over that pretty clearly. Moses Liddell. Oh, actually, he does a really, really nice job. He doesn't show any of it, but he talks through the preload and the geometry of the different pieces together, and he does a really nice job of just explaining it in a very simple way. And that's the way I wanted to see what was going on. I didn't want to just torque it down, trust that everything was working together, and just let it go from there. So I did finally stumble upon his video after a couple of months of looking at different videos and talking to some people, and he does a really nice job. So I'll put a link in the bottom of the description. I encourage you to take a look at that if you're interested. I find that it's helpful if you take a look at a couple different videos. There'll be a couple different vantage points where people will talk about how something works, and you get a little deeper understanding of what's going on there. And so I really appreciated that. So as I'm going to show the preload on here, we're going to test this, and I'm going to take a look at the torquing and the preload, and also the number of turns of the bolt, because again, everybody talks about a 1/2 to 3/4 turn. So what does that mean in terms of preload? You bring it to zero lash just when you can barely spin the push rod, where it's just basically that bit zero lash just means that the rocker is snug on the push rod, and the push rod is snug on the lifter, and it hasn't started to engage it, although any movement at all, and it's going to start to push this plunger down. And that's the preload. And one last thing before I actually get to showing it is that I had this running for a while. I was getting a lot of valve train noise. Again, I had put the bolts on, and I had done the 1/2 turn, 3/4 turn, whatever, and they had not tightened down yet. I didn't really measure the preload. I just kind of did that, went with it. I had a lot of valve train noise. So I took off the valve cover, so now I'm redoing it, but I'm going to reinsert this video doing it properly into the rebuild series. But one last thing is that these are comp cabin lifters, and it's 8212. So that's the number on them. And I don't know whether it has to do with these lifters or not, but most of the time, according to what everybody says, is that this will bleed down, that when you're running it and it's hot and there's oil pressure, the pressure in there again locks the plunger right in the right place with the right amount of preload in it, so it's snug up in the system. When you turn off the engine and the pressure, it's supposed to bleed down, or generally will bleed down, and it will provide a little more give and take, and so the spring will get engaged and it will move around a little bit, and next time you start it up, it'll pump back up, it'll take the slack out of the system, and it'll go from there. Mine did not bleed down at all. I let it set for a week, and these things were as hard as a rock at the top. Once you take off the rockers there, the preload goes away, it pumps back up, and there is no play whatsoever in at least these lifters. And I was a little concerned about that, because you can't test a preload if these things are pumped up and locked. And that was the one thing I was trying to do when I pulled this apart again. And I found that almost by accident that, I tried pressing down on it really hard. I couldn't apply enough pressure to it, and I couldn't get them to release. And you obviously don't have access to the lifters because the head is on it. I didn't want to take the head off. I found that just by turning the motor over, so I retightened down all the rockers, and I turned the motor over 2 or 3 times, and I noticed that some of them started to soften up. I think just the repeated action of the pressure of the push rod from the spring going down onto the lifter, it just has a tiny bit of play in it, and it slowly softened up. A couple of them softened up. I did a couple more rotations. 2 or 3 more softened up. I did a couple more rotations. So it was probably 12 or 14 rotations before I got all of them to soften up, and I could take a look and I could put a dial indicator and go ahead and check the preload on these. So I'm going to show 1 and 2 again, and I also am curious what's the total distance that this plunger will go. I'll see if I can figure that out by putting that in here. And just kind of that idea that it goes from 0 to, let's say, I don't know, 80 thousandths, and just understanding where that preload of 20 to 60 thousandths sits within that range. I'm just kind of curious how that sits and how close to the bottom mark that you actually are when you do preload it between that 20 and 60 range. So let me go ahead and set that up, and I'll go ahead and show it. And before I put the actual dial indicator on here, I just want to show real quickly about how these things are soft. I put this little piece of tape on there, and I put a little line there just so you could see. Hopefully it'll come across. But this is what you're looking for. You're looking for it. You can tell it has some movement there, up and down. And when the rocker goes on there, it's going to press that down. So the rocker is going to go on there. This is going to be flat, and it's going to press this down as it rocks. So one more thing before I start tightening this down is I am at top dead center between the compression and the power strokes, and that is important because I know that I'm on the base of the cam on both the intake and the exhaust. The bridge here with these engines, I actually was playing around with a little bit, and if you torque down one and then you try to measure the other, it's obviously going to push this one down a little bit. So you kind of need to do them in concert. So if you want to be really precise about it, you would do one, loosen both up, and then do another. Either that or do each of them a little bit at a time and just measure one and just assume that both of them are on there. Either way, just wanted to let you know that as I was playing with one, it seemed to be affecting the other. The firing order on these is 153624. I also get reminded of that because it's actually listed on the other side of the intake manifold there. And also this is on the intake valve. This is the exhaust right here. You want to know for each piston that you're doing that the intake and the exhaust are on the base of the cam lobe. And so doing it in the firing order makes sense because I'm at top dead center again, and so I know these are both at the base. At the same time, I can set both of them if you're measuring them. And so you would do number 1 here first, and then you would turn the engine a third of a turn. So you turn the crankshaft 1/3, and that will take you over to 5. So then you put on 5, so then you know that you are on the base of the lobe for both the intake and the exhaust for number 5. And then you do another third of a turn, you do it 3, and then so on, and that will take you back to 2 full turns where you're back to this being on the base. And it doesn't have to be exact either. When I degreed my cam, and there's a couple videos on that as well, is that there is quite a bit of play there in the base of the lobe. You're on the base of the lobe probably 80 to 90 degrees, somewhere in there on either side of top dead center for that particular piston. So you have quite a bit of play. So when I did it before, I just eyeballed a third of a turn, and I could tell that I was on the base of the lobe, and I just did that each time. And obviously you do 1/3, 2/3, and then the full rotation, you can just line up the timing mark, and then you know that's one full rotation, and that would be this number 6 piston. So after you're on top dead center for the first one, a full rotation, you're on 6, and then you do a third at 2, and then another third at piston 4, and then you know that you're on the base of the lobe for both intake and the exhaust. So here we have the dial indicator, and I have it lined up approximately in line with the push rod at that correct angle. I found that there's a little bit of play in it. I have the dial indicator zeroed out, and I have it somewhat snug down. I can still turn I can still spin the push rod. So I'm probably pretty close to zero lash here. It could probably go down a little bit without actually engaging the lifter, but there's no up and down movement. In fact, this is probably pretty good right here. So I can still spin the push rod, but there's no up and down play. There's a little side to side play, but I think that's probably pretty good. And I put a little mark with some tape there because I want to take a look at, it all depends on the thread pitch of the bolt. That's what determines how many turns is going to give you a particular amount of preload. So I'm going to look specifically at this one here. There's also an interesting thing, because it so often is mentioned a half turn, 3/4 of a turn, and then that's the preload and you just kind of let it go, is that for these, since you're torquing it down, it's going to be more than whatever that is, because once that bolt gets seated and the preload is in there, it's going to take another half turn, something like that, to then torque it. It's not actually adding any more preload, but you're continuing to turn it to torque it down. So I'm going to kind of show that in addition to what the maximum amount is. So I'm still planning on doing that. So we're going to slowly turn this, and I found that you can actually pretty much do it by hand. Remember, we're trying to torque this down or get it to where it stops. The preload stops, and it's got to be between 20 and 60 thousandths. So at the same time, you want both of those things to happen. So I had to adjust a little bit. I'm back at 0 again, just to make sure that I have enough play in the indicator. So we're going to go ahead and turn this now. Now, as soon as we start turning this, we should start to see some movement. And there's a 1/4 of a turn right there. That's just about a 1/4 of a turn. And we have about 20 thousandths. We do another 1/4 of a turn. And that's at 40. And that is probably about, so it's interesting that I can seat that just with my hand. I can back off a little bit, I can go, that's as far as I can go. Maybe a little bit more with my hand. So that's right at 60. So I'm about at the max there. I did have my head decked. Maybe that has something to do with it, because that'll add some length to it. So I got about 3/4 of a turn, not quite 3/4 of a turn there, and I have 60 thousandths. And that makes sense because I did 1/4 of a turn and I got 20, and I did about half and I got 40. So it's about 20 thousandths in the thread count of preload for each 1/4 of a turn. I'm going to go ahead and torque it down and see how much further it turns. And see how much further it turns to get the torque in there, and then how much also preload that adds. So that was interesting. There was really no more preload added for torquing it down. So basically, as tight as I could get it with my fingers, that's about as much preload as going to be there. And it turned maybe another, it wasn't actually too much, it was probably not even a 1/4 of a turn. It was maybe more like an 1/8 of a turn, or a little bit more than that. But it wasn't much more to get that torque to 19 foot-pounds. Now I'm reading at about 63. It's probably a bit more preload than I would ideally like, but I'm gonna see what the exhaust says. So I'm gonna do the exhaust as well. And also, while I'm here, I want to take a look at what's the maximum preload, or how much will that spring and that plunger take. So I'm gonna see if I can push this down hard enough. Maybe I can get something to wedge on there, just to see what's the maximum preload. So I'm pressing that down about as hard as I can go, and it's about 120. So the total distance there is about 120 thousandths, so this is about halfway down. I was always wondering what that was, that total lifter preload, or that the spring distance, and it's about 120 thousandths of an inch is what the maximum for these particular ones. It's probably somewhat similar for other lifters, but this is 120. So it's just interesting to know that I'm about halfway in the distance for the spring inside the plunger. So I'm going to go ahead and loosen both of them up, move the dial indicator over, and do the same thing on the exhaust side, just to see what I get. So I'm going to bring both these to 0 lash, or somewhere thereabouts. So yeah, the intake is pretty good there. And then this here, I think that's pretty good there. I'm going to go ahead and zero this out. Alright, we're going to do the same thing here. So I'm going to go, and then I know it's at 0 lash if the dial indicator starts moving as I turn it. Yep, it's just starting to turn. So that's about a quarter turn. Well, that's interesting that we actually know that it's about 20 thousandths per quarter turn. So actually I think maybe I didn't have it quite settled right. Let's try that again. There was a quarter of a turn, so not quite 20. There's another quarter of a turn. Oh, and that's as far as it'll go. So let me back it off. Even if I torque that, it's not going to go much more. So I got 40 there. Let me just back it off just to see. I think that little bump past it is. Yeah, I think the little bump past it is something else going on there. So yeah, this one's about 40. So this one's about 40, and this one's about 60. And I'll go ahead and I'll torque this one down again, show that there's really no more preload being added in, going from hand tight to torquing. And there it goes. Yep. That's 19 foot-pounds. It did not move. So I'm going to go ahead and finish up there, just doing number one. You would just repeat the same thing with 1, 5, 3, 6, 2, 4, the firing order. Again, turning that crankshaft 1/3 of the way around for each one. If you had a V8, it would be 1/4 of the way around, and then you would go according to that firing order. I'm getting a little bit more on the intake than I am on the exhaust. Again, I had the intake, it was at about 60, and the exhaust was at about 40. 60, maybe getting a little bit on the high side. I'm going to go ahead and run with that. The others weren't quite 60. I think they were more in the 50 range when I had done them before, the other intakes. And the exhausts were all pretty close to 40 as well. So I think I'm in a pretty good spot. I'm going to go ahead and torque those down, check everything out, put the valve cover on, and go ahead and crank it up. And we'll see if that quiets down the sort of valve chatter or the tapping. It was really coming from this number one, I think, when I was trying to listen to see where it was coming from. It was number one. And it was a number one that I had initially left too loose. And I had redone it again, and I didn't allow it to bleed down, so it remained loose. Anyways, I think I have the exhaust in number one pretty well settled down. And again, we'll give it a shot and we'll see how it sounds.